Picture this. It's 1680, and somewhere in the rugged canyons of what we now call New Mexico, Apache scouts are crouched on sandstone ridges, watching something that must have seemed like a vision from another world. Below them, Spanish cavalry thundered through the valley floors, men encased in steel armor that caught the desert sun like mirrors, riding these massive four-legged creatures that the Apache had never seen before. Horses. Now, I want you to think about that moment for a second. Here were the Apache, who had been the undisputed masters of this landscape for centuries. They could cross terrain that would break the spirit of most humans. They knew every hidden spring, every game trail, every place where you could disappear if you needed to vanish. They were the ghosts of the Southwest. But suddenly, these Spanish conquistadors had introduced something that changed everything: mobility on a scale the Apache had never imagined. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Within a single generation, we're talking about the span of time from when your grandfather was born to when you're having kids. These same Apache warriors became the most feared mounted fighters in all of North America. Not just good horsemen, not just competent cavalry, the absolute masters of mounted warfare in terrain that would challenge modern vehicles. Think about what that means for a moment. The Spanish had been riding horses for over 1,000 years. Their entire military tradition, their culture, their identity was built around horsemanship. These were the descendants of the men who had conquered the Aztec Empire, who had dominated battlefields across Europe. And yet, within 25 years, Apache warriors who had never seen a horse before 1680 were outmaneuvering Spanish cavalry like they'd been born in the saddle. The Chiricahua, Mescalero, and Western Apache bands each adapted horsemanship to fit their unique territories like a glove. The Chiricahua, living in those jagged mountain peaks that rise like broken teeth from the desert floor. They perfected mountain riding through terrain that would make a mountain goat nervous. We're talking about narrow ledges where one wrong step means a 500-foot drop, rocky slopes where loose stones could trigger avalanches, passes so narrow that two horses couldn't ride side by side. The Mescalero bands, masters of the Chihuahuan Desert, developed navigation techniques that seem almost supernatural. They learned to read the desert like we read road signs, following star patterns, wind directions, the behavior of desert animals, the smell of distant water sources. A Mescalero warrior could guide his horse across 90 miles of seemingly empty desert and arrive at a hidden spring with the precision of a modern GPS system. And the Western Apache? They turned the broken canyon country of central Arizona into their personal highway system. Picture the Grand Canyon, but multiply that by 100 smaller versions, endless mazes of sandstone cliffs, hidden valleys, box canyons that look like dead ends until you know the secret passages. Western Apache horsemen could disappear into this landscape like smoke, appearing 50 miles away before their pursuers even realized they were gone. The first Apache horse raids against Spanish settlements near present-day Socorro became the stuff of absolute legend, and I mean that literally these stories were told around campfires for generations because they seemed too incredible to be true. Apache war parties would approach Spanish ranches on foot in the dead of night, moving like shadows across the desert floor. They'd study the layout, count the guards, identify where the horses were kept. Then, in the space between midnight and dawn, they'd steal entire herds, sometimes 50, 60, 70 horses, and vanish into the darkness before the first rooster crowed. But here's what really gets me about this story. Horses meant so much more to the Apache than just military advantage. These animals transformed Apache society in ways that rippled through every aspect of their lives. Suddenly, Apache bands could follow the great buffalo herds deep into the plains, following migration patterns that covered hundreds of miles. They established trading networks that stretched from the markets of Mexico City all the way north to the Pueblo villages along the Rio Grande. We're talking about a commercial network that rivaled anything in North America at that time, and the spiritual relationship that developed. The Apache began incorporating horses into their most sacred ceremonies, their creation stories, their understanding of the world itself. They developed a complex naming system for horses that reflected not just their physical characteristics, but their personalities, their spirits. Names like Swift Cloud, Shadow Walker, Desert Thunder, these weren't just labels. They were recognition that these animals had become partners in the Apache way of life. Apache children learned to ride before they could properly walk. I'm not exaggerating here. 3-year-olds who could barely form complete sentences were riding bareback across terrain that would challenge experienced riders today. And the women Apache women developed techniques for moving entire households on horseback that would make modern military logistics officers weep with envy. They could pack everything a family needed to survive: food, shelter, tools, weapons, personal belongings onto horses, and move camps across 50 miles of desert in a single day. But perhaps most remarkably, the Apache developed what you might call a psychological partnership with their horses that went beyond anything the Spanish had achieved. Where Spanish cavalry treated horses as military equipment, valuable, yes, but ultimately expendable, the Apache saw them as extensions of their own bodies, their own spirits. And this relationship, this bond between Apache warriors and their horses, was about to be tested in ways that no one in 1680 could have possibly imagined. Because change was coming to the southwest, change that would transform these master horsemen into something even more extraordinary: survivors, who would push the limits of human endurance to places that seem almost supernatural. What they were about to face would force them to make choices that would shock their enemies and challenge everything we think we know about the relationship between humans and animals. By 1820, Apache leaders were staring at a mathematical problem that would have made Sun Tzu himself break out in a cold sweat. Picture the equation. Small bands of perhaps 50 to 200 people, men, women, children, elders, being pursued by armies numbering in the thousands. Mexican cavalry units, American military expeditions, bounty hunters, militia groups. We're talking about odds that would make a Vegas bookie laugh you out of the casino. Now, most military strategists would look at those numbers and conclude that resistance was impossible, surrender or die. But the Apache? They found a solution that emerged from the marriage of ancient wisdom and brutal pragmatism. And when I say brutal, I mean a practice that would shock anyone who grew up around horses, anyone who's ever felt that bond between human and animal. When an Apache horse could no longer continue, when it was spent, exhausted, pushed beyond its physical limits, it became 30 days of food for a family on the run. Let me pause there for a moment, because I know what you're thinking. You're thinking about cruelty, about betrayal, about the heartless sacrifice of loyal animals. But before you judge, consider this. A 1,000-pound horse could provide sustenance that meant the difference between capture and freedom, between life and death, between the survival of Apache culture and its complete destruction. This wasn't some casual decision made by warriors who didn't care about their horses. These were people who had developed the most intimate relationships with horses of anyone in North America, children who learned to ride before they could walk, warriors who trusted their lives to their horses every single day. The decision to kill a horse for food was made with the weight of absolute necessity, when every other option had been exhausted. The practice began during what historians call the Mexican period, the 1820s through the 1840s, when Mexican armies would chase Apache bands for weeks through the Chiricahuan Mountains and across the Sonoran Desert. These weren't short pursuits, weekend manhunts. We're talking about military campaigns that lasted months, with thousands of soldiers, hundreds of scouts, supply trains stretching for miles, Mangas, Coloradas. And, this is a name you need to remember, was a 6'6" giant who united multiple Apache bands during this period. The man was a tactical genius who perfected these survival techniques during his campaigns of the 1840s and 50s. Picture him, a warrior who could look most men in the eye while they were on horseback, leading raids that became legendary across the Southwest. His typical operation would work like this. Mangas Coloradas would strike Mexican supply trains near Llanos, a fortified town in northern Mexico. His warriors would hit fast and hard, loading their horses with everything: valuable weapons, ammunition, food, silver, trade goods. Then came the real test. They had to cross the Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man. 90 miles of desert that earned its name honestly. No water, no shade. Temperatures that could kill a man in hours. Mexican cavalry, following standard military doctrine designed for European warfare, would preserve their mounts, travel at sustainable speeds, set up proper camps with water and forage. Meanwhile, Mangas Coloradas would push his horses to their absolute limits. His warriors would ride day and night, covering ground at speeds that defied belief. But here's the genius part. At predetermined points, locations scouted and planned in advance, exhausted horses would be killed and butchered, with efficiency that would impress modern slaughterhouses. Every part was used, every single part. The meat was dried into jerky that could last for weeks. Hide was cut into emergency moccasins for warriors whose footwear had been destroyed by the rocky terrain. Bones were cracked open for marrow, pure fat and protein that could sustain a warrior for days. Blood was mixed with desert plants to create a nutritious paste that sounds disgusting but could keep you alive when nothing else was available. Mexican cavalry units, following their traditional pursuit patterns, would arrive at these butchering sites days later to find only scattered bones and cold fire pits. Their quarry was already 50 miles deeper into Apache territory, moving on foot across terrain where horses couldn't follow, surviving on carefully preserved horse meat while Mexican soldiers struggled to find water for their mounts. Think about the psychological impact of this for a moment. You're a Mexican cavalry officer, trained in European military traditions, chasing what you think are mounted bandits. You arrive at their last known position expecting to find tired horses, maybe abandoned equipment, signs of a group struggling to stay ahead of your pursuit. Instead, you find the systematic remains of a meal, evidence of a people so committed to their freedom that they would consume their most precious possessions rather than be captured. The practice evolved and became more sophisticated over time. Apache bands developed specific protocols for horse consumption based on the tactical situation. If pursuit was immediate and intense, horses might be consumed raw, with warriors cutting strips of meat and eating while still moving. If they had a few hours, meat would be quickly smoke-dried to preserve it for longer journeys. Different cuts served different purposes. The lean muscle meat became travel rations. The fatty portions provided immediate energy for warriors who might have to run or fight within hours. The organs, heart, liver, kidneys were consumed first because they provided the most concentrated nutrition and spoiled the fastest. But perhaps most remarkably, this wasn't just about individual survival. Apache society was structured around extended family groups, clans that included elders who couldn't fight, children who couldn't run, pregnant women, people recovering from injuries. The horse-killing practice allowed these entire communities to remain mobile, to stay ahead of pursuing armies, to maintain their way of life in the face of overwhelming military pressure. Mexican military reports from this period read like ghost stories. Commanders would describe pursuing Apache bands that seemed to simply vanish into the landscape. Supply trains would be hit by raiders who appeared from nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. Horses worth fortunes would be stolen in the night, only for the thieves to abandon them in the desert days later, taking only what they could carry on foot. What these Mexican officers didn't understand was that they were facing an enemy who had redefined the very concept of cavalry warfare. Where traditional mounted forces were limited by the endurance and care requirements of their horses, Apache warriors had developed a system that treated horses as both transportation and portable food supply. This mathematical solution to impossible odds was about to face its ultimate test, as even more powerful enemies appeared on the horizon, bringing with them military technologies and strategies that would push Apache endurance tactics to supernatural extremes. The 1860s brought something to Apache country that changed everything: the full weight of American military power, fresh from a civil war that had transformed the United States into a modern industrial war machine. We're talking about armies equipped with repeating rifles, telegraph communications, systematic mapping projects, and military commanders who had just finished conducting total warfare across the American South. But here's what's absolutely mind-blowing about this period. Instead of crushing Apache resistance, this massive pressure only refined their endurance tactics to levels that seemed to defy human biology. It was like trying to destroy a diamond with a hammer. You don't break it, you just make it harder and more brilliant. Cochise, and this name should be spoken with the same reverence as Alexander or Napoleon, was leading his Chiricahua band through the Dragoon Mountains of southeastern Arizona when he orchestrated escapes that military historians still study. today. I'm not talking about lucky getaways or clever tricks. I'm talking about systematic demonstrations of human endurance that redefined what was considered physically possible. His most famous escape happened in 1861, after a confrontation with American troops that historians call the Bascom Affair. Cochise found himself surrounded by multiple cavalry units in the Chiricahua Mountains, rough country that looks like the surface of an alien planet, all jagged peaks and hidden canyons. The American commander was confident he had trapped the Apache leader and his band. Cochise led his people 140 miles in 2 days. Let me repeat that because I want you to really understand what I'm saying. 140 miles. In 2 days. Through mountain terrain so rugged that modern hikers with GPS and lightweight gear consider 20 miles a good day's work. But here's the part that really gets me. During this escape, Cochise's band killed and consumed 3 complete sets of horses. 3 different times, when their mounts could no longer continue, they stopped just long enough to butcher them for immediate consumption, then continued on foot while American cavalry horses died of exhaustion trying to match half that pace. American military reports from this pursuit read like accounts of chasing supernatural beings. Officers would describe finding butchering sites where Apache families had consumed entire horses in less than 2 hours, then disappeared into terrain that looked impassable. Cavalry units would push their mounts to the breaking point, only to discover that their quarry had somehow increased the distance between them. And this wasn't just about the men. Women like Lozan's sister of the war chief Victorio and a warrior in her own right demonstrated that Apache endurance transcended every assumption about gender and physical capability. Lozan could run 70 miles without stopping. Not walk, not jog, run, at a pace that would challenge modern marathon runners, across terrain that would break the ankles of anyone not raised in this landscape. She could also shoot more accurately than most men, ride horses that others couldn't control, and navigate by stars across hundreds of miles of desert. But perhaps most remarkably, Lozan was said to possess the ability to sense the direction of enemies through a ceremony that allowed her to feel their presence like a compass pointing toward danger. The practice of consuming horses for endurance reached its strategic peak under Geronimo during the 1870s and 80s. Now, Geronimo is a name that's been mythologized to the point where it's hard to separate the man from the legend. But the facts are incredible enough without any embellishment. Geronimo's band never numbered more than 40 warriors, 40, against 5,000 American and Mexican troops specifically assigned to capture or kill him. Think about those odds for a moment. It's like one person trying to hide from a city's entire police force, except the city covers an area larger than most European countries. General George Crook, and this guy was perhaps the most capable officer to face the Apache, a man who understood unconventional warfare better than most admitted in his personal journals that conventional cavalry tactics were completely useless against an enemy who viewed horses as moving food supplies. Crook wrote, "They can live where our horses cannot survive, travel where our cavalry cannot follow, and sustain themselves on resources that would not keep our pack animals alive. We are not fighting warriors. We are fighting ghosts who happen to be better equipped for this environment than we are." Geronimo's most legendary escape came in 1885 when his band was surrounded in the Sierra Madre Mountains of Mexico. Picture this. Thousands of troops, both American and Mexican, had cornered him in a box canyon. Multiple escape routes were blocked. Supply lines were cut. By every military calculation, surrender was the only option. Instead, Geronimo ordered his band to kill all their horses for what they called a victory feast. They consumed as much meat as they could hold, then each warrior took 40 pounds of dried horse meat and scattered in 8 different directions on foot. They reassembled 200 miles away in Arizona Territory. 200 miles. Across terrain that pack mules couldn't traverse, carrying 40-pound loads, in a matter of days. Moving through country where Mexican and American patrols were specifically watching for them, the psychological impact on pursuing soldiers was devastating. Many reported nightmares about Apache warriors who could simply step off the edge of the world and reappear anywhere they chose. Some cavalry units refused to continue pursuit, claiming their horses were exhausted, but reports suggest the men were more broken than their mounts. What American military commanders were slowly realizing was that they weren't just fighting a different enemy, were fighting an enemy that operated according to completely different rules of physical reality. Apache warriors could travel farther on foot than cavalry could on horseback. They could sustain themselves in terrain where army supply trains couldn't operate. They could disappear into landscape that looked empty and emerge from places that seemed impassable. The horse-consuming practice had evolved into something that went far beyond simple survival. It had become a strategic weapon that allowed a handful of people to tie down thousands of troops, to control vast territories, to maintain their independence in the face of overwhelming technological and numerical superiority. But perhaps most remarkably, it demonstrated something about human potential that challenges our modern understanding of endurance and survival. These weren't superhuman beings. They were people who had developed, through necessity and generations of accumulated knowledge, the ability to push their bodies and minds to extremes that we've largely forgotten are possible. Mexican and American military reports from this period consistently describe Apache movements that seemed physically impossible. Families covering 60 miles in a single night, warriors running for days without apparent rest, groups of people disappearing into areas that had been thoroughly searched and emerging weeks later hundreds of miles away. What these reports were documenting was the result of a culture that had spent centuries perfecting the art of survival in one of the world's harshest environments. Every technique, every practice, every seemingly impossible feat was the product of accumulated wisdom passed down through generations of people who lived or died based on their ability to endure. The horse-killing practice was just one element of this larger system, but it was perhaps the most crucial. It allowed Apache bands to maintain mobility when conventional wisdom said mobility was impossible. It provided sustenance when the landscape offered none. It gave them the energy to travel distances that exhausted their pursuers. But this way of life, this ability to exist at the edge of human endurance, was about to face its final test, because the world itself was changing in ways that would make even supernatural endurance irrelevant. Geronimo's final surrender in September 1886 marked not a military defeat, because militarily, the Apache had never been truly defeated, but something far more profound: the closing of a world. The very landscape that had made Apache tactics invincible was being systematically destroyed, not by armies, but by progress itself. Picture the transformation happening across the Southwest during the 1880s. Those vast open territories that had allowed Apache bands to disappear for months at a time. Railroad lines were carving them into manageable sections. Hidden water sources known only to indigenous peoples for thousands of years. They were being mapped, claimed, and developed by mining companies and cattle ranchers. Ancient travel routes that had allowed Apache families to move unseen across hundreds of miles. Telegraph lines now connected every settlement, every military post, every trading station. The last free Apache bands found themselves living in a world where their movement patterns could be predicted by telegraph communications faster than they could actually travel. Their hidden water sources were marked on maps distributed to every cavalry unit in the territory. Their food caches were being discovered through systematic searches conducted by Apache scouts working for the American Army. And that last point, Apache scouts working for the Army, that's something that cuts to the heart of what was really happening. The Americans had learned something that the Spanish and Mexicans never figured out. You can't beat the Apache by using conventional military tactics. You beat them by turning their own knowledge and techniques against them. These Apache scouts weren't traitors in any simple sense. Many were men whose families had been killed in conflicts, who saw cooperation with the Americans as the only path to survival for their children. Others came from bands that had traditional rivalries with groups like Geronimo's Chiricahua. But whatever their motivations, they brought to the American military something that no amount of technology could provide: intimate knowledge of Apache tactics, Apache thinking, Apache survival techniques. Suddenly, American cavalry units knew where to look for butchering sites. They understood the logic behind Apache movement patterns. They could predict when a fleeing band might kill their horses for food, and they positioned troops accordingly. The supernatural advantage that Apache endurance tactics had provided for over 2 centuries was being systematically neutralized, but there was something even more devastating than military pressure destroying the Apache way of life. The reservation system was specifically designed to make traditional Apache life impossible. Think about it. The entire horse-killing survival strategy depended on vast open territories where bands could travel for weeks without encountering settlements or military posts. Reservations concentrated Apache people in small areas where that kind of long-distance travel would mean immediate starvation, not escape. The reservations were typically located in areas with limited water, poor soil, and no game animals. Apache families who had lived for generations by following seasonal patterns, hunting in the mountains during summer, gathering desert plants in winter, trading across vast networks that spanned from Mexico to Colorado, suddenly found themselves confined to parcels of land barely large enough to support farming, which most Apache had never practiced. For people whose entire cultural identity was built around mobility, endurance, and intimate knowledge of vast landscapes, reservation life was a kind of slow-motion death. Warriors who could run 70 miles without stopping were reduced to standing in line for government rations. Women who could move entire households across 50 miles of desert in a day were confined to permanent structures on land that couldn't support their families. Yet even in defeat, the influence of Apache endurance tactics rippled far beyond the end of their resistance. Army officers who had spent years chasing Geronimo men like General Crook and Captain John Burke established the first Special Forces training programs in American military history, incorporating Apache techniques of survival and movement. These weren't just theoretical exercises. During World War I, American soldiers in France used Apache water-finding methods when conventional sources were contaminated or destroyed. In World War II, troops in the Pacific Theater employed Apache endurance practices and survival techniques that had been documented by military officers during the Apache campaigns. The Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, specifically recruited men who had grown up in the Southwest and learned traditional Apache skills from older generation settlers who had lived through the Apache conflicts. These men became some of America's most effective agents in occupied Europe and behind Japanese lines. But perhaps most remarkably, the horse-killing practice itself, shocking to 19th century sensibilities, dismissed as barbaric by contemporary observers, is now understood by anthropologists and military historians as an ingenious adaptation that allowed a numerically inferior people to resist colonization for over 200 years. Modern nutritional science confirms what Apache people knew instinctively. Horse meat provides an almost perfect balance of proteins, fats, and nutrients needed for extreme endurance activities. The Apache technique of consuming different parts of the horse for different purposes, lean muscle for sustained energy, organs for immediate nutrition, fat for long-term caloric storage mirrors current understanding of optimal nutrition for ultra-endurance athletes. Military strategists studying asymmetric warfare conflicts, where small, mobile forces face numerically and technologically superior enemies, consistently point to Apache tactics as early examples of techniques now used by special forces worldwide. The ability to sustain small units in hostile territory for extended periods, living off resources that conventional forces can't utilize, traveling through terrain where mechanized units can't operate, these are core elements of modern unconventional warfare. Today, Apache descendants serve in elite military units at rates far exceeding their percentage of the general population. Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Marine Force Reconnaissance. These units actively recruit from communities where traditional Apache knowledge has been preserved and passed down through generations. In modern Apache communities from San Carlos in Arizona to Mescalero in New Mexico, elders still tell stories of ancestors who could travel beyond the possible. These aren't just historical accounts, they're cultural instructions about human potential, about what people can accomplish when survival depends on pushing beyond accepted limits. Young Apache people today learn these stories alongside modern education, understanding that their ancestors developed techniques that allowed them to thrive in one of the world's most challenging environments for over 1,000 years. The horse-killing practice, once seen as evidence of Apache savagery, is now understood as sophisticated resource management that enabled cultural survival under impossible circumstances. But perhaps the most important legacy of Apache endurance culture isn't military or strategic, it's philosophical. In a modern world where people often feel disconnected from their physical capabilities, where technology mediates most of our interactions with the natural environment, Apache traditions remind us that humans are capable of extraordinary feats when necessity demands and culture supports such achievements. The stories of warriors who could run 70 miles without stopping, of families who could survive for weeks on carefully preserved horse meat while traveling across terrain that would challenge modern vehicles, of people who chose death before surrender and found ways to make that choice mean freedom rather than defeat. These stories honor not just the warriors but the horses who gave their lives so the people might remain free. In the end, that's what the horse-killing practice really represents: the willingness to sacrifice what you love most in order to preserve what matters most. Apache warriors didn't kill their horses casually or cruelly. They killed them with the reverence of people who understood that some things are worth more than life itself, and that sometimes the price of freedom is the consumption of everything you hold dear. The thunder of Apache horses across the Southwest went silent in 1886, but the lightning of their endurance, their refusal to accept the impossible, their transformation of necessity into supernatural ability that lightning still flashes in the stories elders tell, in the techniques that modern warriors carry into battle, in the reminder that humans are capable of far more than we typically demand of ourselves. The Apache didn't just survive because they could kill and eat their horses. They survived because they understood something that we've largely forgotten, that the difference between life and death, between freedom and captivity, between existing and truly living, often comes down to how far you're willing to go beyond what seems possible. And sometimes, the distance between possible and impossible is exactly as far as a horse can run, before it becomes the sustenance that carries you beyond the horizon.